Hey everyone, today I want to walk you through a way to analyze a variable annuity, get down to the truth about how it really works. Now, if you already own one of these, or maybe you've been considering buying one, but you're going to want to hear some things that I talk about today that's going to help you determine if a variable annuity has a place in your portfolio. When we're finished, you're going to have a step-by-step process that's going to make it much easier to understand how they actually work and what you can expect if you own one of these. Now, fair warning, we're going to take a deep dive here. This is the same process I use when I'm showing a client or potential client how their annuity works. You might need to hit the pause button or rewatch a few areas to really understand all the things that we're going to cover today, but I do promise you it's going to be worth it to understand how these work before you buy one, or to help you make the decision about keeping yours if you happen to already own one. Now, before we jump too far in, let me go back to the basics and make sure that everyone is on the same page and understands what a variable annuity actually is. There are several different types of annuities. Two that sound similar based on the marketing brochures are the fixed indexed annuities and variable annuities. They typically are both tied to the performance of the stock market in some fashion, and both will often have a guaranteed income component that can be added through a separate rider. But today, we're talking specifically about variable annuities. And essentially, a variable annuity is a package of mutual funds in an insurance wrapper. Now, they don't call them mutual funds, they call them sub-accounts, but effectively, they're the same thing. In fact, you can often see sub-accounts with the same name as their mutual fund counterpart that you can buy outside of a variable annuity. And since these sub-accounts go up and down with the performance of the investments within them, it gives you a variable performance, thus the variable annuity. And most of these variable annuities are sold as a way to stay invested in the market, but have guarantees attached to the income you can receive. Let me give you a quick demonstration of how a typical variable annuity with income rider works, and then I'm going to give you a list of questions that you need to get the answer to so you can evaluate these for yourself. So what I've done here is set up a very simple spreadsheet. Now, if you're familiar with Excel or Google Sheets, you can duplicate this, or you can easily do this with a simple notepad and some basic manual math. Now, for purposes of our example here, I'm going to assume that this is for someone who's 55 years old, so we can see what happens on both sides, both before someone is taking an income, and then what happens once the income starts. And for now, we're only going to pay attention to the columns labeled current value and income base. We're not going to factor in fees, not yet anyway. That's where we're getting to some of the pieces that aren't discussed very often, so don't leave until we get there. So let's go over the differences between the current value and the income base. Some insurance companies will have different names for these. For example, the current values may be called the contract value, and the income base may be called the guaranteed income value or the accumulation base. But whatever name they call it, they all generally work the same way. The current value column is the value of your underlying investments, those sub-accounts. This is the same as if you bought individual mutual funds. The value goes up and the value goes down, and you see that clearly on your statement. And if you decide to sell the annuity, that current value is what you get. Except with a variable annuity, it would be less surrender charges, which typically apply in the first 7 years or so. Now, the income base works differently. This is where the guaranteed income rider comes into effect. It generally will not go down unless you take a larger than allowed withdrawal from the contract. And in most of these annuities, there's actually a guaranteed increase to the income base as long as you aren't taking income out. Now, most of them that I've been seeing lately are in the 5% range. So as long as you're not taking an income, that income base will increase by 5% per year. And then once you turn your income on from the annuity, the income payment is guaranteed to be a certain percentage of that income base. And in most cases, this is 5% or so. Now, the allure here is that it is generally guaranteed to last for your lifetime once it turns on, but you should know the definition of lifetime income can change between insurance companies. So let's walk through an example of this and see how it works out. So let's assume that this person is currently 55 and they want to retire at 62. They open this annuity by putting in $100,000. This would be their current value and their income base as soon as they open it. Now, at the beginning of the second year, let's say that their current value has decreased to $90,000 because of a bad market. Now, the income base would not have followed that decline. It would have actually increased by 5% to $105,000. The following year, the sub-accounts do much better, and the current value is now back to $102,000. Now, if the contract uses a compounded rate of increase to the income base, that income base would now be $110,250. Now, you should also know that not all contracts use a compounded increase. Some use a simple increase, which makes a big difference over time. Now, the following year, the sub-accounts have another 10% return, and now current value is $112,200. The following year, the markets fall again, and your current value declines by 8% to $103,224. And then the income basis increases yet again by 5% to $121,550. The next year, the markets have a good year. This means that your current value increases to $115,621, and the income base increases by the standard 5% to $127,627. But the following year, the markets have a really good year, and the sub-accounts increase by 20%. Now, this is where a lot of these contracts have a provision that says that if the current value ever exceeds the income base is going to get caught up to the current value. They'll often refer to that as a step up. In this example, if the income base was to grow by 5%, it would be $134,008. But since the current value is higher, the income base would become the same as the current value. And that happened just in time for this person to retire at 62 and turn their income on. This means that at a minimum, they could expect 5% of the income base as a stream of income for the rest of their life. So even if the market goes to heck in a handbasket, they can expect $6,937 per year. Again, contingent to the terms of the contract and what lifetime actually means. Now, at this point, the current value would just continue to fluctuate and the income base likely wouldn't change. So that's the promise that the marketing brochures like to tout: guaranteed income regardless of market performance. But as you may have suspected, there's more to the story. There's a lot more, in fact. For starters, illustrations like these that people just draw out on their whiteboard generally don't include any fees. And that changes everything. And I'm going to show you that in just a moment. But to get a real understanding about what to expect, you're going to have to do a little research. And to do this, you're going to need to call the insurance company that issued the annuity and ask them a few questions. Now, I would not recommend calling the advisor who either sold this to you or is trying to sell this to you to get this information that you're going to need here. If it's like most of the cases I see, they're going to know that you're nosing around in territory that they'd rather not talk about. And while I'm sure they won't actually outright tell you a lie, they get some propaganda mixed into the answers. And you just need the facts here. Now, if you already own an annuity, most of the information you're going to need is probably in the original annuity contract. That's the booklet that you were given when you bought the annuity. But there's no way to tell if that information is still accurate. For example, when you bought the contract, it may have had an income rider that cost 1%. But if you look closely, the various components of these contracts that have fees will often have a current expense and a maximum expense listed. So that fee can change over time, and you need to find out what is that fee today. So get out one of your statements or get on Google and find the customer support phone number. And once you get them on the phone, I'd recommend getting started with the fee question. Here's what you're going to need to ask. What is the mortality and expense fee? What is the administration fee? And sometimes they'll combine that into one fee and call it the M&E with admin or something like that. Then you want to ask, what is the sub-account fee? And then next, You want to get to the fee for any riders. For example, if you have a guaranteed income rider or a death benefit rider, most likely you're going to hear something like this. The mortality and expense ratio is probably going to be around 1.25%. The administrative expense is going to be close to 0.15%. Now, all of the subaccounts in your variable annuity likely have different fees, but the annuity companies will usually just use a flat 1% as the average number, and for the sake of what we're doing here, that's going to be sufficient. And then the rider fee for the most common guaranteed income riders is around 1.25%. But if you also have a death benefit rider, that's going to be an additional cost as well. So if you look at these that we have here so far, you can see that doing a quick tally, the total cost of this annuity is 3.65%. But also need to ask what these charges are a percentage of. Most of them will be charged based on your current value, but the income riders are almost always charged to your income base. Now, I'm going to get into that nuance in just a moment to help you figure out how much these things actually cost. And when you're on the phone, it also wouldn't hurt to ask them a few questions about how the income rider works. Does the income base increase by a simple or compounded rate? You need to know what happens if the current value ever gets to zero. Will the income continue as it has, or do they force you to annuitize? And if they force you to annuitize, you need to know what value did they use as the annuitization value. You may also want to find out if they force annuitization at a certain age. I've seen quite a few of those contracts recently as well. And what this means is that if they force you to annuitize, your future income wouldn't necessarily be based on that income base. It would be based on, right now, an unknown number, unless they can tell you what that number is, but many of them can't. So your income could be cut, and that cut would be drastic, and it would happen when you were older, so certainly at the worst possible time. Another question is, do you restrict the subaccounts that I can choose from? In many cases, an annuity with an income rider will have a very limited selection of subaccounts to choose from. In many cases, these are going to be managed volatility funds, which have a track record of seriously underperforming the market. But the simple truth is, the wider the difference between your current value and your income base, the harder it is for you to leave. I've seen the difference between those two values in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. And obviously, if you leave, then you're leaving a lot of income potential on the table. So it makes it very difficult to take that current value, go somewhere else, and generate about the same level of income. So the annuity companies are, in a way, incentivized to almost underperform so you get stuck. And one last Hail Mary question you may want to ask is, how much does my agent get paid, or will they get paid from this contract? Or did they get paid if you've already bought it? Now, they may or may not tell you, but having this information may help you to understand some of the reasons that your advisor either sold this to you or is trying to sell it to you. The typical range is the 5 to 7% commission, which is normally all paid up front. So if you're thinking about a $250,000 purchase, there could be a $17,000 payday for the person who sells it. And sure, everybody ought to get paid for the work they do, but when you have commission rates that are that high, unfortunately, there's often a perverse incentive. Now, there's really a lot of other questions you could ask, but now you have the essential information you need to chart this out and see how it will really work. So let's go back to the spreadsheet I built and add in the fees. Now, to keep this nice and easy, we're going to act as if the annual return will be a straight line 7%. Now, we all know that's not how averages actually work, but it's impossible to illustrate this by pulling random returns out of the air. Also, I think that a 7% return is really generous here because most of these will have restrictions on subaccounts that have track records of less than 7%. But that's what we're going to use. So we'll assume that the initial deposit was $100,000. That means that in year one, the current value and the income base are both $100,000. And in year one, there's no income payment because this person isn't retired yet. So we'll put a 0 there. So now we have to enter the fees. The M&E is at 1.25 and 1.25% of the current value is $1,250. Now, the admin is 0.15% of the current value, so that's another $150. The sub-account fee is 1%, and that adds $1,000. Then the rider fee is 1.25%, but remember, it's typically charged as a percentage of the income base. And at first, those values are roughly the same, so it doesn't make a difference now, but it will in the future. And when you add the $1,250 from that rider fee and then sum it all up, it brings the total fee up to $3,650. So let's go to the next year. If the return projection we're using is 7%, it would seem that the new current value would be $107,000. Remember, the fees have to come from somewhere, and they're not paying them, you are. And this is taken directly out of your current value. So the accurate way to do this is subtract the fee amount from last year's value and then increase by 7%. That gives you a net result of $103,095. But hey, your income base is going up by 5%, so that's going to be $105,000. And we can go back through all of the fee components and see how they'll all be increased since that current value increased. And now that total fee for the second year is $3,787. Now, since this person isn't taking income until he turns 62, we can fast forward and see how this would have progressed with those straight line returns of 7%. That would put him with a current value of $119,614 and an income base of $134,010. Now, before we move on to the phase where this person started taking his income, I wanted to point something out. He had invested $100,000. It was now worth $119,614. So he'd made $19,614 under our average return assumption of 7% less fees. But you add up the fees he's paid, this means that the annuity company has literally made more than he has. So now you're probably starting to get an idea of how I feel about these. But let's move on. And now this person is ready to turn on his income. It's guaranteed to be 5% of the income base, so that's $6,700. So much like the fees, this amount paid in income has to come from somewhere. It's not magic. So in subsequent years, the income payment and the fees are subtracted from the current value. This means that even though he had a 7% return, his value went down to $119,618. And if we do this for a few years, it doesn't take long before the current value is substantially lower than the income base. And as the years go on, smaller and smaller until finally at 84, the current value runs out. And then what happens? Well, I can tell you that will vary from annuity company to annuity company. You can't assume that lifetime income means that they're going to keep paying you the same amount even when the current value gets to zero. But the real question here is, how would this have compared to just keeping it simple and investing in a low-cost portfolio and taking the same level of income? And since we're this deep into it, let's look at that comparison. And I want to weight this heavily in the favor of the variable annuity. So if you're thinking about buying an annuity or you've already bought one, it's probably because there's some fear about the market. So in doing a side-by-side comparison, let's continue to assume that the investments in the variable annuity will get an average of 7%. But for an investment portfolio, let's assume that it only averages 5%. And don't forget about the fees. Let's assume that you're paying a 1% fee to your advisor and they've put you in a low-cost portfolio that's 0.09% in annual expenses. This means that your total annual expense here is 1.09% total. Now, we already know from looking at the table that the annuity at a 7% average return would run out of money. Beyond that, who knows how it would continue to pay income. But the investment portfolio at a 5% average return would still have funds in it all the way to age 90. Now, it's going down every year, but much slower than annuity. And that's all because of the fees. Even at a lower rate of return, it's still going down slower. But watch what happens if we assume more of an apples to apples comparison. And we look at the investment portfolio that also has a 7% rate of return, which now matches the annuity. The value never goes down. In fact, it would give you the ability to increase your income if you needed to, which is not built into the income payments from a variable annuity, which is another issue I have with those, is that we can't assume that what you need in today's dollars is never going to increase. So the value of those income payments from an annuity will decline every year because they don't have any provision to include any cost of living adjustments. Now, is it all going to work like this in the real world? I have no idea. I do know that returns are going to fluctuate and your results are going to vary, but in a quote normal environment, this is pretty close. You know, my ultimate advice is that if you haven't already bought a variable annuity, I generally recommend steering clear. Now, I often joke and say that most annuities are good for two different types of people: the people who own insurance companies and the people who sell annuities. And if you find yourself with an annuity and now you're not sure what to do with it, my team can help you with the numbers just like what we went over today. And before you let another year tick by while you're holding one of these, you do need to understand how they work, whether you do the analysis or you have someone help you. And if you want to get in touch with us, I'm going to put a contact form down below. And when you fill that out and submit it, someone's going to respond to you within just a few hours after you submit. Well, I know that this video was much longer than most of my videos, so thank you for sticking around and watching to the end. And if you know of any of your friends or family members who are either caught or about to get caught in the variable annuity trap, please share this video with them. Thank you for watching.